Good evening and welcome to the Tony Kinnett Cast here on the Daily Signal, nationally syndicated first on 93 WIBC. No matter where you are joining us from this evening on Monday, August the 24th, whether it's on the TV side, radio, the podcast, live streaming, we are glad that you are with us. A couple of years ago, this show did start, though, just as a tiny radio show on WIBC in Indianapolis. Today, that crew has lost a very wonderful man and a mentor and a friend of mine, Matt Baer, who did a lot of the traffic reporting over at WIBC. Also had a phenomenal podcast about recovering from addictions. He died today at the age of 48. He was a wonderful man, and I owe a lot to him. I've never known anyone who can so seamlessly pivot from doing the very detailed, specific part of his job. He never wrote anything down. He literally had windows upon windows of all of the streets of Indianapolis open, just to keep an eye on the cameras, provide really good coverage, encourage people to stay safe, and then again to seek those out who are recovering from addictions. And he was, again, a very, very wonderful man. So if you would keep his family in your prayers, I would greatly appreciate it. Sorry, I don't normally start the show off that way, but that just little personal note here from yours truly, given that our home station is still, and will be for as long as I'm happy to say it, WIBC in Indianapolis. Now, there is some breaking news out from the Supreme Court, and it is a big one. Now, could I begin by saying I called this back around August the 12th? Yes, and I will. So, in a 6-3 kind of a vote, I say apparent 6-3 vote because this is a little unusual for injunction rules, the Supreme Court paused a federal judicial order that had previously blocked key parts of President Trump's election executive order. So the majority of the Supreme Court, really more 7-2 than it was 6-3, stepped forward and issued this particular ruling that the president issued an executive order. Several of these various parts of the EO dealt with the upcoming election and elections in general. One of these big categories involved the Postal Service, because the United States Postal Service is under the authority of the executive branch. And the Supreme Court said essentially three things. Number one, the Supreme Court said that the president, the chief executive, is in fact in charge of the post office. Number two, you can't simply get out there and issue an injunction because you think that Donald Trump is going to do something. That's not how it works, boys and girls. Even if Donald Trump was going to make some kind of an order and order someone out there to do something a little crazy, a little out there, maybe something a little wild, you can't issue an injunction against someone before they've even done it. You can't go in and Captain America, Civil War, the Avengers here. That's not how this works. Finally, last but certainly not leastly, the Supreme Court said that states absolutely should file any kind of a lawsuit the second that the citizens of that state or commonwealth's rights, note the language, the citizens of that commonwealth or state's rights are being violated. The Supreme Court will immediately hear the decision. So Governor Josh Shapiro, Democrat governor of Pennsylvania, threw a Category 5 whining fit over this today. And he launched into this big, huge, long message. As long as I'm your governor, I'll always stand up to protect Pennsylvania. I fought back when Donald Trump tried to slash our funding for our education and healthcare. By the way, that's the whole carrot and the stick approach. When it's, well, what if we just pass a bill and we just say, if you really want this money, states, then you got to do these things and hop this scotch, and then we'll give you money. That's not a thing. The reason that's not a thing, and you can see from Shapiro bragging here, Governor Shapiro of Pennsylvania, blue states will just sue and say, you need to turn the money spigot back on. It doesn't even matter if the federal government has the evidence that there are millions and millions of dollars flowing fraudulently into daycare programs, whether you're talking about Minnesota, or flagrantly fraudulent trucking and transportation companies, as we've seen in Ohio and Minnesota and Indiana and in Texas and California and Pennsylvania and Nevada and Washington and Oregon and Idaho and on and on. It doesn't matter. States will sue for that money to come back open because there is no, you do this and I'll give you money. States will just say the money's there. It's for me. Money, me, give me money, give me money. So Shapiro then continues and says, we're protecting our free, fair, safe, and secure elections and standing up to Donald Trump's attempt to take your private information. That's essentially what he's really, really upset about. He's angry. He's scandigerously upset because the Supreme Court said, yes, the President of the United States does, in fact, have the ability through the post office to ask the Postmaster General to collect the names of those who are using the mail. You don't have a constitutional right to mail in a ballot and then no one knows that it's you. The Postal Service, the post office, is run by the executive branch. If Nevada wants to turn tail and start using FedEx, it can. Maybe. We don't know. We've never really tried this before. If California wants to start using UPS, well, then the boys in brown, sorry, not the brown shirts that are running Newsom's administration, the other brown shirts, they can drive around in the trucks and pick up ballots. But that's currently not what they have set up. And again, in this particular decision, the court didn't decide whether Trump's order is lawful. That's not what happened. Instead, it ruled that the state sued too early. You jumped the gun. You're not allowed to do this yet. False start, 15-yard penalty. The order directs federal agencies to act, but imposed no requirements on states. Basically said all of your injuries that you claim is going to poison our crops and our water supply and deliver a plague into our houses. Yeah, that hasn't happened. Essentially the meme from SpongeBob where the guy starts screaming about all the things that SpongeBob's bubble buddy has done. Like, are we just going to sit around and wait until he dies? The Supreme Court says, no, that's not a thing. On citizenship lists, by the way, the Supreme Court says that states are not required to use citizenship lists, and any harm depends on how the Department of Homeland Security ultimately acts. However, the United States is allowed to use citizenship lists at the federal level. You can't just order the Department of Homeland Security or the Department of Justice or the IRS to toss aside citizenship lists because you're worried that, as Governor Josh Shapiro put it, that it's somehow going to stop women from getting abortions. At the very end of his tweet, by the way, he says, as long as I'm your governor, a woman's right to choose will always be protected in Pennsylvania. The young women in the womb couldn't be reached for comment. Anywho, the Supreme Court did say that the Postal Service has now finalized its rules, and the Supreme Court expressly says that states can challenge a final rule that harms them. The reason I point this out is that all of the media punditry and commentators that you're going to hear tonight, I'm sure, from major outlets, I'm sure that right here, right now, ABC is running a big, huge, long, angry tweet saying that it's all over. Trump has destroyed, the headline, the really sneaky headline that you'll see a lot of people, not yours here on the Tony Kinnett Cast, but a lot of people will say that the Supreme Court has rubber stamped Donald Trump rigging the post office in the elections and securing the whatever. Nope. They simply said that states sued too early, and until you actually bring some evidence, until you actually show your CVS receipt 8 miles long of all of the things Donald Trump did just to you, then no. I'm afraid not.
Nope.
That's the ruling. However, Ketanji Brown Jackson. That's right, boys and girls. Ketanji Brown Jackson, she digs out the crayons, she gets to work. So Ketanji Brown Jackson puts her hair up in the ponytail. She says, I'm not going to read any of these laws or constitutions. And so she writes this big scathing dissent, and I'm not joking here. Ketanji Brown Jackson, in just, not even in the full ruling for the Supreme Court, in just an initial injunction slapdown, like the case is still ongoing, Ketanji wrote a 23-page dissent, longer than the entire court's opinion and the principal dissent, meaning the literate stuff that was typed out by like Elena Kagan and Sotomayor. Ketanji Brown Jackson essentially just drew angry, illiterate Calvin and Hobbes comics for 23 pages. And the majority of the court was not at all amused with her arguments. In fact, they made fun of her. So a quote from, I believe, John Roberts, fighting this court's precedent, Justice Jackson maintains that the government is not injured in the slightest because the order contemplates that the government will engage in patently unlawful conduct. That, however, remains to be seen. And though Justice Jackson wishes it were otherwise, the applicant can show irreparable harm from a threshold error without showing that at the end of the day, it will prevail on the underlying merits. So essentially, then another point, they say the balance of equities does not counsel against awarding the government interim relief. So essentially, Ketanji Brown got out the crayons and wrote, "Why people? The white people are at it again. And the government and the fascism." And all of the other justices looked at her, pinched the bridges of their noses, sighed, and with ballpoint pens and adult typewriters called her a clown, which is, to be fair, probably what she should be called. That's the first of 3 pretty significant wins for the Trump administration. Radio crew, I have to send you over to the commercial break before the FCC starts accusing me of using crayons. It's the Tony Kinnett Cast. We're going to continue on the live stream in the meantime. Now, never you mind. Don't worry. There is another pretty decent election ruling, a bonus, if you will. Kentucky voters, the United States District Court for the Western District of Kentucky in the Louisville Division, stated that Kentucky voters are less likely to be wrongfully removed from the rolls after the state election board issued a new regulation that will improve the accuracy of list maintenance practices. The new regulation was adopted after a pro-voting group sued to block the state's voter purge law. And so what's really funny about this right here, you had a bunch of everyone gets to vote, don't look at my ID, I'm going to show up in a bed sheet and vouch for 7 other people. That crew sued in Kentucky because they were mad that there was a new provision which was going to check the voter rolls. Because apparently there's this idea that the people who could register to vote before are too stupid and poor to register to vote again if something has changed or something is wrong, or, oh, hey, you don't live here anymore. Well, again, the U.S. District Court for Western District of Kentucky, Louisville, said, no, honey, sweetie baby, checking the voter rolls actually makes elections more secure, which, of course, you and I already knew. Reading it above a 4th grade, level just so happens to have such an effect. There's more news. That's right. I told you. We came with the receipts today, boys and girls. The Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals issued a pretty significant ruling today, reaffirming that federal district courts, James Boasberg and Judge Indira Talwani and Judge Sparkle Shine, Love and Hugs, Share Care Bear, they're not allowed to prevent the government of the United States from deporting an individual, whomever they may be, whether they violated a visa, whether they were here illegally and they crossed in, whether they came and they declared asylum and they got rejected, whether they were a temporarily protected migrant and now they're not anymore, whatever. Federal judges can't stop someone from being deported just because some lawyer says ICE was really big, mean, and stinky. So essentially, here's what would happen. You would have some guy, let's call him a Maryland man, a certain Maryland man. He would be out there and he would be doing the kind of things that Maryland men often do, shoving people into the back of vehicles with too many seatbelts and doing some human trafficking, or, committing various kinds of fraud or violent crime of a various selection. And then, once they were arrested by Immigration Customs Enforcement, their lawyer would say, Your Honor, objection, ICE is really mean, and they're stinky, and they're awful, and it's very mean. And so then you would have a certain judge. Usually, as a former Politico article of 2018 said, a female immigration judge would say, oh, really? Someone was mean to you? Well, then you can't be deported. And the State Department and the Department of Homeland Security and the Department of Justice and several state governments said, hey, he's still here illegally. You want to go after ICE, you have that right, I suppose. But you don't get to halt the illegal immigration process. Like, if I'm trespassing on a certain property and I'm harassing individuals there and security comes to escort me, and as I'm being dragged out the door, I say, you can't evict me from this Target. In fact, I sue Target. So I get to stay here forever. Nope. That's not how it works. That's a pretty significant decision today. The actual opinion, by the way, says the defendant's appeal in district court granting a preliminary injunction in response to the plaintiff's allegation that during a 3-day period in January of 25 around Kern County, California, Border Patrol agents detained individuals without reasonable suspicion. You mean they were messing around the border and Border Patrol said, that looks suspicious. And then they arrested them and they said, ICE isn't allowed to do that and not deport them. The court says, yeah, I'm sorry. Whether ICE or Border Patrol or Jeff on a horse decides that person looks illegal and then deports them because, guess what? Survey says they're illegal. Then you can't just turn around and then hold them from deportation because you're afraid that the officer was profiling of some sort. So big wins on that side. Radio crew, welcome back from the commercial break. It's the Tony Kinnett Cast here on the Daily Signal. Now, on the last of court news today, the State Department has fired back after a Biden-appointed judge overturned its freeze on immigrant visas from 75 countries. So Judge Jeanette A. Vargas said this was a horribly racist, evil action, said it was Orwellian, that consular officers were denying immigrant visas. She said that they're eligible applicants. Said you can't deny people solely because of their nationality. That is going to get overturned really quick. The spatula of the U.S. court system is going to flip that one quicker than Cracker Barrel flipping my cornmeal pancakes. Sorry, those up in New England, I know that's what you don't call them. You call them like Dodgers or something. They are delicious, but this is going to get overturned even quicker than those delightfully hot griddle cakes. Why? Because the Secretary of State, again, this is just like the Postmaster General. If you want to tell the president what to do, Congress has this really cool ability. They can change the duties that they expect the President of the United States to perform. You want to limit the amount of offices out there doing office stuff? Then say those offices are closed or out to lunch or on permanent recess. You're going to circle back next congressional session, whatever. You have the power to remove them. And what's funny is the Supreme Court of the United States has essentially issued more of those opinions. This isn't my job, leave me alone. If Congress wants to stop being lazy and change things, they can. They've issued more of those opinions than almost any other kind of opinion in the last several sessions for the Supreme Court. That's why you hear, for example, Tom Homan, border czar, saying the exact same kinds of things. Hey, you want to change how we do border enforcement? You want to change how we do visa acknowledgement, as Secretary of State Marco Rubio has said? Then change the law. That's the rule. Now, on that particular side, there is a lot of pearl clutching, bleeding, horse whinnying, and neighing because several migrants, not just from Cuba, but from Venezuela, China, Indonesia, have been deported to a place that, I don't know if you have an atlas or, maybe a globe. In fact, we do here on the Tony Kinnett Cast. Give me a second. Check it out. This here globe, you may notice if you have an illegal immigrant from, let's say, China or from Taiwan or Indonesia, maybe you move it over here to the Western Hemisphere side of things. Maybe you've got somebody from Brazil, from Argentina, from one of our Central American countries, maybe even got somebody from Cuba. And the State Department deported these individuals to some place that's right next to Central and South America and China. By that, I mean, they deported them to Central Africa. And that's really, really funny. I'm sorry. I just think, CBS News got on a little video call as a Cuban illegal immigrant who had an order of removal, who was told that if he would deport himself from the country to anywhere else he wanted to go, he wanted to leave and go to Mexico, he wanted to leave and go to a Central American country, a South American country, if he wanted to go to Spain, I hear Ceuta's taken volunteers, then he could choose to voluntarily self-deport, and the United States, meaning you and me, would pay him. We would pay him to self-deport. And he said, no. And so he ended up getting shipped to Central Africa. So here's CBS News trying to communicate with all of the migrants who are staying together. Again, Russian, Venezuelan, Cuban, and Chinese illegal immigrants. It's a Tower of Babel situation in Central Africa. Check it out. It says we're stuck.
Money. No pueden salir de ese edificio. You cannot leave that building.
Says, so wait a minute, you can't leave the building that you're in? Now notice the CBS reporter isn't speaking in Spanish, isn't speaking in English. Just something to note here. You don't actually say, well, they left the United States where they were safe and they're not speaking the language of the United States anymore. They're speaking the language of Central Africa. Says no, can only leave if there's an official with us. They took Daniel away yesterday. They've detained us here in this facility. We can't leave. We don't have documents. We're suffering and missing our families in a continent we don't know. Another culture. There's a lot of violence here. We can't leave. Now, please, by the way, whatever you do, don't question whether that's a wonderful place on Earth. I'm told if you say it's a bleep-hole country, Conan will go lounging, maybe not in a beach because it's, in the middle of continental Africa. But I don't know, maybe he can go over there and climb a tree, do a sunbath in the dirt, because he went vacationing in Haiti, I'm told. But anyhow,
Estados Unidos nunca te avisó que te iban
the
a
U.S.
deportar
never gave you
África.
notice
The
that you
US
were getting
never
sent to
gave you
Africa?
notice that you were getting sent to Africa.
He says, no, I learned after 5 hours on the plane that we are going to Africa. I like this, as though, like, they talk about this individual, this illegal immigrant who was here in the country illegally, who had violated the law. This guy, like, he didn't just show up to the airport and there was a guy like, vámonos, a Africa, vámonos, eh. Like, that wasn't the thing that happened. Like, I didn't get on there and go, I thought you were taking me to Sonic for the slushy. Like, that's not what happened. He was given the opportunity to self-deport on every social media platform, on billboards, in newspapers, in text messages, on the CBP1 border app. Remember the outrage when the Trump administration took Biden's "Hey, you're here, now hang out" app? They changed the app to say, "Go home. We will pay you. Go home." It's like, oh, you never heard anything? No, I was there. No, escucho anywhere. No, and the people in Africa, they don't know picky penny. Like, what on earth?
Deported because of a criminal record?
Yo no tengo ningún antecedente criminal, solo o de infracciones de tránsito.
So he says, I don't have any criminal record. I just have, some traffic violations. So, once again, the criminal record would be, violating the laws here in the country. I do want to point out there have been some statements made by the, American administration here. They're talking. By the way, I do want to mention on August 22nd, reported by the outlet Border Hawk, these illegals had previously refused to be deported to Liberia, the United States, like, free state that they established for slaves who were freed, who wanted to go back home to Africa. Liberia, they said, hey, do you want to go to Liberia where you're less likely to get shot in the face multiple times? No, not Chicago, Liberia. And they said no. And they said, okay, well, this isn't a restaurant. Like, we're not here to say, oh, well, then perhaps you'll enjoy antipasta in Italia. No. If you're not going to go to Liberia, well, then you'll go to the next place they'll take you. So 3 of these migrants, a Brazilian man and a Cameroonian female, not Indonesian, Cameroonian, excuse me. The plane continued to Equatorial Guinea, and they were forced to disembark against their will. So 40 former illegal aliens being held in a hotel in Malabo, Equatorial Guinea. Interesting. Again, he said, by the way, this is the statement: if a judge finds an illegal alien has no right to be in this country, according to the Department of Homeland Security, we are going to remove them. We're going to remove them, period. Yep, that's absolutely correct. Radio crew, unfortunately, I have to send you over to the commercial break while we talk about some of the other pretty impressive immigration customs news, also some huge news out of the Middle East and some international trade stuff that probably matters more to your wallet than anything else you're hearing about. It's the Tony Kinnett Cast. We'll continue on the live stream in the meantime. Now, the Immigration Customs Enforcement Division of the Department of Homeland Security and the Department of Justice, the organization that has been charged with arresting those who have removal orders by judges here in the United States. They are here illegally. They have made the decision now under Department of Homeland Security Secretary Markwayne Mullen to begin an operation that has apparently concluded, and no one knew anything about it whatsoever, which in today's day and age is pretty impressive. The number of individuals who are leaking to the press where ICE is and what operations they're doing, that's kind of been put on the back burner. A lot of Democrats right now who were expecting to run kind of anti-ICE campaigns heading into the midterms haven't. In fact, a lot of Democrat operations right now are spent on the communication side talking about Donald Trump's assistant, like one of his staffers and aides, and whether or not she's smiling or not. So stellar idea if you're on the opposition side of things. Homeland Security has announced, with an exclusive to Bill Malugin over at Fox, ICE quietly carried out one of its most successful operations in agency history, resulting in the arrests of 1,328 illegal aliens in just a 14-day span in the states of Virginia, and Maryland. Nearly 400 of the aliens had criminal convictions or pending criminal charges, including a Salvadoran illegal alien wanted by police in Richmond, Virginia, on a murder warrant. Now, again, one might make the case that if Abigail Spanberg, the governor of Virginia, had allowed federal law enforcement to work alongside Virginia law enforcement, then perhaps this Salvadoran illegal alien, Egner Wilfredo Hueso Moran, perhaps they would have been able to find him sooner instead of in this particular operation. Also, you probably would have seen fewer, just letting you know, fewer illegal immigrants that were arrested, because then federal and state law enforcement would have coordinated turning over those on retainer, that kind of a thing, instead of just going through neighborhoods and conducting the operation. Other targets included illegal aliens with rap sheets for attempted murder and rape, as well as convictions for sexual battery, kidnapping, robbery, and driving while under the influence, which is a bit interesting because some of those traffic stops that the Cuban immigrant says that's all that was a problem. Apparently, one of those traffic stops was a DUI, driving while under the influence of alcohol. This DWIs, though, driving under the influence of a controlled substance among these arrests, however. And right now, the U.S. is also set for the largest mass visa revocation in history, targeting up to 200,000 foreigners. And despite what one federal judge, Jeanette Vargas, has made the, argument to say that the Secretary of State doesn't have the authority over visas, au contraire, mon chéri, it just so happens that whether or not she calls it an exercise in Orwellian logic, she has no, and I mean none, zero, zip, zilch authority over how the federal government chooses to allow and grant visas. That is solely under the control of the President of the United States. Now, in the meantime, Democrats around the country are still trying as best they may to go all in on calling for immigration customs enforcement to be abolished. The Democratic Socialists of America are calling for police and prisons to be abolished, while simultaneously suggesting, again, in a very contested, very controversial midterm election, that they are going to, take over the country with a violent revolution, just openly admitting, hey, it's going to be a very violent process, which is a move. That's a decision. It's an interesting decision, but it's a decision all the same. Radio crew, welcome back from your commercial break. It's the Tony Kinnett Cast here on the Daily Signal. Now, while we get to some of these Democrats announcing that they want to disband and abolish law enforcement, in the meantime, again, here is their DSA wing of the party brought into the big tent that Chuck Schumer in his awkward dad green golf polo was ranting, excited to bring him into the big tent of the party. So anyway,
we have seen that the Democratic Party establishment that we have has to be ripped out. We can actually start to grab hold of the ship of state and steer it in our direction, but it's going to be a, violent process.
Our country needs to change, and this Democratic Party needs to change. I was more than glad to go on Hasan's stream. We need, as Democrats, we need to go into these spaces.
Israel has a plan of creating a greater Israel in the Middle East.
And Eretz Israel would require Israel to expand, quintuple its size.
That's Joy Reid.
By eating up half of Lebanon.
So here's the plan. What they're going to do is they're going to go into the midterm election and suggest, and I'm not joking here, I'm really not joking, we need to get rid of immigration customs enforcement and ICE because of Israel. That's right, because of the Jews. The Jews are hurting all of these poor migrants, I'm told, on the left. This is the left-wing argument on the aisle. Now, that's, of course, very stupid and not very, very intelligent. But again, whether you're looking at the Democratic Party making these bizarre claims right here and right now, for example, Massachusetts Democrat Seth Moulton, he's running against incumbent Senator Ed Markey, I believe, at the present time. If not, if Ed Markey, is Ed Markey retiring? Yeah, well, either way, Ed Markey and no, yeah, he's still running. I was going to say, even though Markey is 80, he's running again. Okay, he's not retiring. Seth Moulton, representative in Massachusetts, who is running as hard as he can to unseat the incumbent. Well, I mean, here he is just saying the quiet part right out loud, and it's kind of embarrassing for him.
And let me be clear, ICE needs to be abolished because the organization is completely corrupt. It's staffed by thugs, and that's why.
It's staffed by thugs, he says. Meanwhile, the DSA is like, we need to violently overthrow the country.
Why I was the first in this race to say that they need to be prosecuted as well. I think a mistake that we made after the first Trump administration is not doing enough to hold them accountable, to just sort of go back to normal and think that things were going to return to the way they were before. We've got to hold this administration accountable.
Hold the administration accountable by burning everything to the ground. It's a move. It is a move. It's a strange one for sure, but it is in fact a move. Now, on the other side of the DSA and the ICE, Ilhan Omar, representative of Minnesota, she is also having a little bit of a rough time. And the reason she's having a rough time is because it is now confirmed that immigration customs enforcement proceedings are being at least moved forward here. ICE has denied some FOIA records about Ilhan Omar, citing ongoing proceedings and a legal exemption. Essentially, though, the immigration customs enforcement investigation by the Department of Justice and the Department of Homeland Security into Ilhan Omar comes in a couple of different flavors and places here. So first and foremost, she has been a citizen since 2000. She's not being deported. However, investigations into whether actions both before and now are fraudulent have been in progress, I should say, for the last couple of months. Now, whether or not that becomes a criminal referral for the lady who likely married her brother to evade immigration procedures and, yuck, gross stuff. If she starts getting into a significant fraud investigation, that's not only going to hurt her, because one of the spurs of investigation that it appears Ilhan Omar's, again, fraud investigation happens to be connected to would be Act Blue. Now, as we've covered last week, Act Blue, the primary grassroots Democrat funding apparatus, in which, again, last week, its leadership before a closed-door session with a congressional committee pleaded the fifth on everything regarding whether or not they took foreign dollars and didn't check for it. I mean, at some point, at some time, you've got to consider that maybe Ilhan Omar and her husband and the California winery that actually was never a thing, at some point something is kind of going to break, and it's an interesting time in the party because it is far easier right now for Democrats to just get rid of anyone who's causing some kind of an embarrassment in this midterm than keep them around because of social DEI standards. So again, it's Representative Gomez, I believe, who is, according to his own party's ethics committee members, Democrat ethics committee members, demanding that they need to release that ethics report immediately on whether or not he violated his staff before it becomes too late to replace him before the midterms. And this is the problem that they're facing, because a lot of their candidates are now moving to a place where it doesn't matter whether they're trying to distance themselves from the wackos. They've already elected the crazy in a lot of places. Angie Nixon down in Florida, Abdul El-Sayed up in Michigan, who has already taken the tiny amount of momentum that he had for a half a second on maybe data centers and flock cameras. He's tossed it aside because, Hasan Piker was running around over the weekend cheering the death of Charlie Kirk and also going after Jewish members of the Michigan legislature, or at least a candidate for Michigan legislature, or a House seat, excuse me. And also just going after J.D. Vance's grandfather? Yeah. So as a quick reminder, Vance, at the end of last week, was in Ohio. He was in his old stomping grounds. Whereas I'm from Middletown, Indiana. J.D. Vance, who I am not, was in Middletown, Ohio. He was talking about his grandfather and about hardworking Americans, making the pitch to the average American worker. It's something both parties attempt to do. Now, that union down the line manufacturer has moved kind of more under the big tent of Trump. That's why Michigan really matters here, by the way. Michigan voters, well, although Michiganders and, Buckeyes are not fond of each other for good reason, the whole union worker side-by-side thing does kind of matter. So here's Vance making this pitch about his grandfather. And then Abdul El-Sayed comments on it for no reason, and it gets ugly.
It's sometimes actually hard to understand, like, what do these modern Democrats actually stand for? But look what they say. Pay close attention, and they'll leave these little hints of what they actually care about. Now, El-Sayed, this guy running for Senate in Michigan, he once argued, not too long ago, that criticisms of Sharia law were rooted in white supremacy.
He did. He said that on the air. He said that on recording. And he has since. His various campaign surrogates, all the way from Hasan Piker. Hasan Piker accused half of Michigan Democrats. Again, El-Sayed barely eked out a victory in the primary against Haley Stevens, the Joe Biden, Chris Farley, SpongeBob awkward love child, who flapped her hands like Joe Biden going, Sharda! I barely squeaked out a victory. Hasan Piker called all of the voters for Haley Stevens Islamophobic. And again, Wahat Ali, Rashida Tlaib, freaking out, suggesting that the entire of America is very Islamophobic. Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib is trying the same thing. Vance calling this out here is on point.
I'd love to go back in time and tell my papaw that there's a man who claims to stand for working people who says not only should we have Sharia law, but if you criticize it, you're a white supremacist. That's not my papaw's Democrat Party, my friends.
Now, here's the part that is rather ill-advised for his particular campaign. Abdul El-Sayed then, quote, tweeted, "So do we think JD is taking Usha with him back in time to meet Papa or no?" So Abdul El-Sayed running a very tightly contested race, saying, you know who's really racist? Old on the manufacturing line Democrat men. Suggesting that Usha Vance, the Indian born or the Indian heritage wife of the vice president of the United States, would receive a cold, bad reception. I mean, calling all of middle America in the Rust Belt old and racist and disgusting, man, that certainly's never bitten Hillary Clinton on the rear end before. Again, it's not a good idea. We're doing the exact same kind of stuff. Seriously, the exact same kind of stuff. So again, for example, Rashida Tlaib calling any criticism at all. Said, oh, Islamophobia, it's on the rise across the entire country.
The human impact is real.
Yeah, of course.
It is. No, it is real. Like, you know, school starts for many families in Dearborn on Monday. And they should be going out back to school shopping with their children, with their families. Yet they had to stay home because of the fear. You know.
Oh, the fear. Oh, they held a rally in town. Oh, no, man. Oh, gee, I just couldn't help but notice that when I looked at the recent, terror attack in Michigan and, the vehicle driving into the Jewish day school and like the daycare and the synagogue that also, by the way, there were Islamic children in attendance at, or the terror attack up in Michigan, up in Maine, all of the other various Muslim-based attacks. Gee, I sure can't help but notice that it's not Islamic people that are getting mugged and attacked in the country.
Waj, I got a call from my sister who said a friend of hers, was at a CVS at the pharmacy, and she came out and there was a guy with the AR-15 walking around saying, "Go back to where you came from."
Okay, of all of the things that didn't happen, this didn't happen the most. And that young man's name, Albert Einstein. And then everyone on the airplane stood up and clapped and said, "Jussie Smollett, this is MAGA country. Give me that Subway sandwich." Radio crew, watch out for AR-15 wielding Islamophobes on the commercial break. We're going to break this down on the live stream. It's the Tony Kinnett Cast here on the Daily Signal. So if you're going to tell a story like this, probably not best to go, so like my sister's friend's cousin's brother was at like a CVS, not the one she normally goes to, but like a different one. And outside, Rambo was holding a Kimbo 2 fully semi-automatic Glock AR-15 assault rifle machine gun launchers. And she stepped out and he said, which roughly translates to like, "Go home, Islamic scum." And he pissed himself right there. Oh my God. I mean, just please stop. Isn't going to convince any voters. Actually, no. Continue doing this. Continue. All of the Jussie Smolletts, take to the streets. Subway sandwiches in hand. Jared Fogle style politics running from Michigan to Maine. Beautiful. So all of these decisions aside, on the Democrat side of the aisle, that brings us around to, what is the Trump administration doing? What are they actually doing? What are we seeing from the Trump administration? There was, by the way, there was some stuff over the weekend. Abdul, he went after, I mentioned a particular candidate, a Jewish candidate. Hasan Piker kind of doing the same, trying to distance himself, split a little bit away from Piker by saying, oh, Hasan shouldn't talk about Jewish people in a mean fashion like he's always been doing. I should play this clip real quick here.
And you want to know why? Because people don't Israel any longer. And if Jews in America keep putting this idea out there that they are singularly invested in Israel, eventually someone's going to come around and take action, not against the state of Israel, mind you, but against American Jews.
Okay, so what is this all about? So there's this dude, this particular individual, well, he's a Michigan Democrat, I believe. His name's Jeremy Moss. And there is an old recording taken out of context. I looked through some of the stuff. It looks very cut up, where he is accused of saying that he's only going to support Israel forever, and he doesn't like America, and he's only going to support the Jews, and apparently he said Chava Nagil, and then he waved the menorah around in fear and whatever. Very, kind of stuff. And it turns out that this Jeremy Moss guy is, he's a Michigan Democrat who's like a very, very pro-LGBTQ plus kind of a guy. That's like his thing. And Hasan Piker then got out there and said, if this guy keeps existing, people are going to start attacking American Jews and be like justified for it. Which is kind of a rough thing to do. So Abdul El-Sayed gets out there and he says, no, actually, I'm standing against Hasan Piker being really anti-Semitic here. It's really bad. And no one believes him. Says, and while politicians and pundits try to make this race about a Twitch streamer, Hasan Piker has been on stage with you at multiple different events. So anyway, that's the Democrat side. Now, on to what the Trump administration is up to. So there are two spicy things the Trump administration is trying to solve. Both of them are on the foreign policy side. Now, we are looking into more on this Trump beef import from Argentina. There are a bunch of really old clips from like 2025 in mid-August being played. That's a full year ago for those of you with a calendar. But we're going to dig into some of that a little bit later this week. Right now, though, while the radio crew is coming back to join us, I want to talk a little bit about the breaking news out of Iran, because it's riot season yet again and tariff season. And the two biggest enemies, I guess, radio crew, welcome back from the commercial break. The two biggest enemies right now to the United States agenda at home and abroad are Foreign Minister Araghchi of Iran and Ontario Premier Doug Ford of Canada. A Canadian official and some Iranian officials. Now that's a choice, boys and girls. Let's dig into the Iranian stuff first here. So Scott Bessent got up and talked a little bit about this economic D-Day against Iran, this plan from the administration where we're going to leave the blockade up in the Strait of Hormuz. We're going to stop any shenanigans from getting to Iran that way. And then all of the other trading partners who have traded with Iran here, there, anywhere are getting slapped with all kinds of sanctions and seizes and freezes, essentially as hard as anyone has hit since Fang Fang clocked Eric Swalwell for getting caught. So here's Secretary of the Treasury Scott Bessent.
The final refuge of this regime is a mistaken conclusion of nations that still finance the Iranian threat in the hopes of evading it. It is no longer acceptable to operate in the gray spaces of this conflict. Countries cannot claim they are blind to enabling this activity. Iran's enablers purchase, transport its petroleum. They facilitate the flow of its finances through exchange houses and free trade zones. They welcome Iran's flights and maintain registries on its behalf. They turn a blind eye to seaborne fuel transfers and overland transits. They condone illicit use of their banks, all the while concealing the extent of their complicity. The president is making phone calls to world leaders with specific requests to cease their interactions with the regime.
Okay, so what I'm hearing before, I've heard before, by the way, President Trump tweeted back in April about some economic difficulties that Iran was having. Then Scott Bessent has floated this idea of advanced sanctions alongside the blockade Operation Economic Fury. This would be the next stage. That's what he's leveling here. Now, some of you may have some questions as to whether or not this includes certain nations. In fact, all of you out there know exactly what nation you are thinking about. You're wondering if Iran is still allowed to shop at Temu. Is Iran still allowed to go to Panda Express and pick up takeout? That's a question that a lot of you have. We'll get there.
We are already seeing results. Over the weekend, comments from Iranian leadership clearly acknowledged the effect of this campaign.
Now, we're going to get to that because the insider information on that stuff is wild. Absolutely wild. I told you that we've seen some factionalizing, some splitting, some tensions as they may be inside the Iranian administration. But for this, I mean, some of the Iranian officials here, it's getting spicy. We're talking like show up to the parliament meetings with a gat in hand, turn sideways for gangster effect.
And nations that facilitate any interactions with the regime should quickly heed our message. Those who stand with the United States will reap the rewards of our partnership. Those who tether themselves to the Iranian regime should expect to share in the isolation of a withering regime.
Now, that sounds really good. Sure. And by the way, even before the sanctions went into effect, the rial, the Iranian currency, which, again, about 6-7 months ago, was really struggling. I don't know if at the time, I don't think, if I look back to my graph here, I don't believe that the number, like the exchange rate for one rial to $1 US, I believe was in the 700s of thousands to equal $1 US. As of today, before any sanctions even went into effect, over 2 million rial equals $1 US. 2,033,000 Iranian rials. Now, there are also some pretty significant shortages and riots that are popping up even now. This video that you are seeing is from I want to make sure I get this right on my map here, from Ahvaz in Iran.
صف بنزین از اینجا شروع میشه 5 صبح ما هم اینجا تشریف داریم ببین ملت رو نگاه کن 5 صبح.
So in Ahvaz, now I'm trying to keep two things on the screen here at once. So Ahvaz, I'm going to cover my face up because that doesn't matter. Ahvaz is in the the southwestern bordering part of the country where it borders Kuwait and Iraq. Currently, you're not only seeing fuel shortages outside, you are also seeing a couple of protests and riots break out. So Ahvaz, Isfahan, and Tehran are where so far we have confirmed protests and riots. And again, why are these protests and riots here? Well, because there's no fuel. There's no fuel. So one guy got out. He's just laying down and he's just praying. These cars and vehicles and trucks, they have been here for ages. There's no gas. There's no fuel. There's nothing. There's no food. And so in this instance, is China going to be able to come to the rescue? Well, all of the ports are blocked up. Now, previously, Iran has had a little bit of one card up their sleeve. They've had the UAE, the United Arab Emirates, which previously acted as their export financier, their fence, for example. You know, you go steal a painting from a fancy museum, not one of Joe Biden's paintings, a real painting. You know, you go and steal Nighthawks, my favorite painting ever, from the Chicago Metropolitan Museum of Art by Edward Hopper. You go out and you steal the painting. You got to sell it. You want to sell it. Well, you're probably not going to know the people to sell it to, so you got to get a fence. You got to get somebody to take the painting and sell it for you with all of their connections. And then they cut you in on most of the money on the back end. The UAE was the fence for Iran. And as of last week, they cut off all diplomatic and economic relations with Iran. None further. Also, according to the New York Post, the Strait of Hormuz has seen a specifically impressive amount of traffic that is picking back up now. Is it back up to pre-Iranian conflict electric boogaloo Gulf War II vibes yet? No, it's not. However, is it significantly higher than it was a month ago? Yes. Meaning this, when the president said, oil is flowing through at rates you've never seen before, You've heard of water pressure, now get ready for oil pressure. Even Don doesn't have enough soap for the oil flowing through the Strait of Hormuz. Okay, when he was saying that a month ago, now we are seeing about 3 times that amount of oil flowing through the Strait of Hormuz. How do they do it? Well, the boats get close to the Strait of Hormuz, that little bend, as it were. I'll try to put that up here on the screen. That little bend in the Strait of Hormuz between the Gulf of Oman and the rest of the Persian Gulf there on the southern middle portion of Iran. Well, the boats would get a little bit closer, and instead of getting close to Keshem Island and having to pay the Bitcoin dollars and listening to Allahu Akbar and some missile and drone tests, they just go south. Now, it's harder to go south. It's a little shallower. It's not as easy to traverse. But they go south, and Iran no longer really has the ability to close the strait. Radio crew, I have to let you go before Brendan Carr at the FCC clocks me right in the teeth for going over. So it's the Tony Kinnett Cast. We're going to continue on the live stream because there's more news. We'll see you there. All right, now the radio crew is out of the way. The UAE being cut off is only half of the pie. What about China? What about China? Because Donald Trump's had a soft spot. He's kind of cut a deal here and there before Chinese students into the country. Well, we're going to do some tariffing, but we're going to back away from it. So is the United States actually going to do a little bit of sanctioning here? Are we going to get a little something extra? Well, Secretary of the Treasury, Scott Bessent, addressed that head on.
The final refuge of this regime is a mistaken conclusion of nations that still finance the Iranian threat in the hopes of evading it. It is no longer acceptable to operate in the gray spaces of this conflict. Countries cannot claim they are blind to enabling this activity. Iran's enablers.
Of those institutions targeted here, is that something that is coming in this campaign, or is the very delicate trade truce with China something that could prohibit you from going that far and taking that very big step?
Now that's a reporter very fancy way of going, are we talking China too? Or like when you get up to China and they say, your sanction no good here. Like, are you just going to back away? What's going to happen?
We want to make clear here today that no one is above the reach of U.S. sanctions.
Now, again, perhaps ironically, China is more susceptible to U.S. sanctions than anyone else, maybe except Mexico, Canada, and the Argentines. Now, Europe is a different ball of wax, and they have their own problems. But as far as direct tariff interventionism by the United States, other than, okay, well, we'll throw Taiwan, Japan, occasionally South Korea in there. The United States tariffs will hit China the hardest if they were, because our economies are linked. Perhaps in a hilarious point of irony, while Nixon was able to undermine the Soviets and open up China economically, which is a huge success, by the way, the downfall of future Chinese communism meant they are deeply intertwined with the American economy. So if we go down, China goes with it.
That if they facilitate transactions and are part of the ecosystem that turns Iranian oil into money, into repression, they will be targeted.
Now, on that target, just to set up where things are here, you may remember that the very first of the Iranian oil tankers that got out and very quickly fled to China, satellite footage and local footage showed that China had those boats off the coast and they weren't unloading oil into China. And Iran eventually had to sell some of those barrels of oil. Some of those ships are still there. They're just sitting there because Iran's refining capacity has completely closed down. Like Karg Island, there's not traffic moving on and off it and even refining things and moving them back into the country. That's why there's a gasoline shortage in Iran for their own people. But China's not buying it either. But this involves, again, the banking, the conversion side of things, because China has an interest in funding the enemies of the United States because they want to be the global hegemon, not us.
We find that the best way to engage with countries is through quiet diplomacy, and we are level setting with every country to tell them our expectations. We know who they are, they know who they are, so when the hammer of U.S. Treasury actions falls upon them, they will have no one to blame but themselves. So.
Okay. Now, I will air just one little final note here, and I'm not going to play the whole clip from you, but on CNBC, the reporter, or I should say the anchor, asked Bessent whether or not the economic campaign included China. And Bessent said, and I quote, "Many conversations are best to have in private." By the way, this is just the correct answer. Just to give you a little bit of analysis here, the Trump administration working in private instead of working via Trump on Truth Social is better. It is. Let those who are in the administration and taking direct and explicit action cook. Do the stuff. Now, Hegseth made it clear they're not ruling out any kind of military action. They swapped out the aircraft carriers, the Abraham Lincoln for the Gerald Ford. They're moving some things forward. There is some movement with the Kurds in the region. But the Trump administration relaxing some efforts and actually imposing some economic infrastructural movement against the Iranian regime is cracking some things on the inside. President Pezeshkian, the civilian president who I've called President Pez Dispenser here on the show before, has been heard inside Iran, according to some Iranian state media sources, saying, "We can't weather any more of this. We're done. We don't have any money. Maybe the IRGC is willing to just subsist off of the knockoff manna that Allah doesn't provide, but the rest of Iran's people needs food to eat and gas to drive." And then the IRGC, after Pezeshkian's statement saying, "Dude, we are at our limit. We're done." After that statement, Iranian media tried coming out and suggesting that actually this has been the plan all along. That now, even now here, Iran has a 2-year plan ready and in place for such an occasion. Now, there's no evidence that there's anything here, no 2-year plan. Iran has been suggesting, like, first of all, this particular strategy has been in place, at least to some degree, by the United States for several months now. It has. Now, again, we can set the MOU aside, the Islamabad Memorandum of Understanding and all of those things, off to the sidelines. And if that wasn't momentarily stopped at for a quick bite back in the summer, where would we be now? Well, that remains to be seen. However, in this particular instance, the Iranians have already tried to sell this assumption that they've been totally fine and they're in the middle of this plan. Now they're saying we're totally going to last 2 years. And then why 2 years? They want to last till 2029. They're hoping this will sink the United States. This, by the way, is the same argument that Senator Mark Kelly of Arizona and James Tallarico of Texas and Chuck Schumer of New York, they're really, really trying to run. Is it going to work? No. Now, on the State Department side, because I told you Hegseth said that they're ready to just throw crap at Iran with a moment's notice, I will say the United States is also producing a large amount of the Shaheed knockoff suicide drones. People think, well, if we don't have a lot of missiles, then what are we going to do? There are currently, I have to be careful how I say this, White Monster energy drink fueled young lads just getting out of college and engineering trade schools in the United States who are 3D printing parts for drones as fast as that little Creality or Bamboo printer can go. And the U.S. military apparatus is moving over a lot of suicide drones over to the region because that's the future of warfare, by the way. It just is. Also, a lot of countermeasures that I absolutely can't talk about over here on the air. Now, while Hegseth is saying, hey, I said before the Lincoln is swapping with the Ford, it's swapping with the George Washington. Deuce Flex, thanks very much for the correction there. I'm sorry that you had to do so, the super chat. Yes, not with the Gerald Ford. I have a clip here from a fighter jet takeoff from the Ford today that has my mind on the Ford instead of the Washington. As far as the administration is concerned, though, on the State Department side, Secretary of State Marco Rubio has issued a series of bounties. Oh boy. And Secretary of State Marco Rubio is now offering rewards of up to $10 million for information on several senior Iranian IRGC officials. The IRGC Commander-in-Chief, Ali Abdul-El-Sayed, the chief of their Central Military Command. The name of their IRGC Commander-in-Chief, the latest one, is Ahmad Vahidi. Their Aerospace Force Commander, their Cyber Electronic Command Chief, and their Intelligence Chief. Now, there are a couple of people who have suggested this violates international law. I will remind you that Iran has already put all of the bounties out on American officials. And in a huge Iranian telethon, and I'm not joking, in a huge Iranian telethon at the end of last week, they were able to raise over $400 for the fund to assassinate the president of the United States. So, $400. That's real special. Now, other Middle Eastern news on the side of things, Israel is accusing Iran of trying to assassinate one of Netanyahu's sons. We'll have to see how certain kind of Middle Eastern espionage is carried out. Saudi Arabia is also changing some of its relations with Israel and again with the United States and kind of other various aspects over the next couple of weeks. We'll be keeping an eye on that. Now, before we get into kind of the currencies and the Secretary of the Treasury diving into reviving the US dollar or weakening the US dollar, yields and percentages and interest rates, I wanted to take a brief moment to talk about our sponsors for today's show, Augusta Precious Metals. If you're interested in learning more about wealth protection and the role that physical gold and silver can play in long-term retirement strategy, Augusta is a great educational resource. Their experienced education team offers personalized one-on-one approaches and web conferences where they will explain to you, that's right, to you, how gold and silver work, gold IRAs, answer your questions, help you better understand your options. And they're not even going to try to lure you into some kind of a order today and get a bunch of gold-plated butterfly coin. They're not going to do that. TonyTrustsGold.com or text Tony to 35052. I'm glad they're our sponsors. They're good stuff. And you don't have to worry about the Treasury Department screwing all of that stuff up, no matter the administration. Yeah, a little fun thing there. So that brings us over to the other big news, the other international enemy for the United States. That's right. Doug Ford, the premier of Ontario. Okay, this one's a little special, ladies and gentlemen. So Doug Ford has had a bit of a history with the United States because in Ontario, they have a few hydroelectric dams that provide less than 1% of all power to the United States. And Doug Ford, the governor, premier, meaning the premier of a Canadian province, meaning the governor of a state, he got all flustergrumped because the president is doing a lot of trade back and forthing with Canada to try to lower prices right before the midterms. That's what he's trying to do. That's what the president is working on. And I'm sorry, I'm not as invested about the whole Canadian automotive industry versus the United States automotive industry. There's a little bit of Belt and Road Chinese manufacturing and sales kind of an issue there. But long story short, the president is doing a lot of back and forthing that some free market conservatives are very, very upset about because they think that we should just let Canada do whatever they want. Even though, again, I'm usually rather anti-tariff long term. The president of the United States going back and forth here. If he can get a better deal, neat. If he can do things with economic pressure here, neat. So in the middle of all of this, while Mark Carney's administration is supposed to be doing some haggling with the president, Doug Ford gets out here and says, we're just going to cut off electricity to the United States and put massive pain on the United States, which is, well, that's a decision.
I'd love to see, him try to grow vegetables and fruit and everything without the potash. I'd like to see when we have our critical minerals. Matter of fact, high-grade nickel, that 65% comes from Ontario for their military, for their manufacturing. But that's not my message to the American people. My message to the American people, let's create Fortress North America. Let's make the pie larger. Let's create more opportunities and more jobs. We buy more autos, 400% more autos than anyone in the entire country, in the world.
Okay, so cool, neat. As to Fortress North America, you don't get to make that argument when your Prime Minister, Mark Carney, is allowing China in every single possible... Again, you've heard my criticisms of this administration and not being hard enough on China and allowing Chinese students in. Half of Canada's western ports are just essentially Chinese fronts at this point. You don't get to talk about Fortress North America when you allow the mass unfettered immigration of migrants from third world countries that makes American illegal immigration look like, DEFCON 5 closed door everything style policies. It's hilarious.
So now the choice is, do we keep buying American vehicles? And that's very personal to people. So, where we can, let's try to buy Canadian. But
excuse me, group here. Are there big major Canadian auto manufacturers? Like, is that a thing? Like, they've got all these American car brands and Japanese car brands. God bless Toyota. And, you've got the European car brands, poor Citroen, and all that leaky mess. I mean, but what are the Canadian car brands? Oh, hey, this here is the Maple Leaf Roadster. It gets 14 pine cones to the beaver. Oh, yeah. I mean, okay.
They'll have multiple auto plants closed down if that's the case.
So sorry, to be quite clear here on this side of things, for Canada, the president doesn't like that a lot of the auto manufacturers, so specifically Ford Canada, General Motors Canada, Stellantis or FCA Canada, Honda and Toyota Canada, builds like high volume crossovers like the Toyota RAV4. Honda Canada assembles the Honda Civic sedan and hybrid models in Alliston, Ontario. Stellantis, the Chrysler Pacifica and Dodge Charger in Daytona, the Dodge Charger Daytona in Windsor. That's just across the way from Detroit. I believe the Chevy Silverado and the GMC, that'd be the Sierra, in Oshawa, Ontario, for example. I understand that. But also Canada is imposing some sharper in-response tariffs that the president says, well, let's just bring all of these down together and no tariffs at all for any reason. And Canada's saying, no, we really still want some quota systems here and there. And so, again, the inside conversations that are still going on, Doug Ford saying, well, I'm just going to get involved and shove my nose in here. And even Mark Carney is saying, no, you're not.
Says he wants to attack the auto part manufacturers. Maybe he just doesn't understand how parts go back and forth 8 times. It would actually shut down your auto plants in the U.S. But we need to hear from the American people. We need to hear from the governors and the senators, which we have heard from northern governors, that this will hurt them. It's not going to help them.
Okay. But again, this is from the State Department and the Treasury Department and future deals to be ratified by Congress. Again, dude, you are supposed to be talking to Mark Carney. What are you doing?
And I've heard from Republican and Democrats, this is not good.
And you mentioned that everything remains on the table if things were to get worse. What would worse look like? Do you have a line in mind already?
Well, if it gets really, really bad, I say everything's on the table. I cannot speak for other premiers.
Oh, boy.
But a couple premiers have a lot of power to protect Canada. Massive power. And I can't speak for them, but we need everyone to be on Team Canada and throw everything in the kitchen sink at them, no matter if it's electricity, if it's fuel, again, if it's potash or uranium. We need to have everything on the table.
Okay, I would love to remind you that at any given time, the United States could simply announce, hey, we own Alberta now, and just take it. I really, really do enjoy, most of the time, I really do enjoy whenever a governor, by the way, be he red or blue, does the same kind of posturing. The Canadian premiers have a lot of freedom and power to do whatever here. They don't actually have the ability to drive foreign policy decisions to that scale. They don't. That's just not quite a thing. Now, here was the Secretary of the Treasury, Scott Bessent, on this, as well as, by the way, the Vice President. In fact, I think we'll go Vice President first, because Vance kind of gives the harder line, and then Bessent kind of the quieter line here.
I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about the negotiations over the tariffs with Canada, and particularly what might you say to businesses and consumers that are worried about the impacts of those tariffs and how those negotiations are going?
Sure. Well, first of all, I'd say we're very mindful of the fact that Maine is a border state with Canada. There's a lot of cross-border transaction between Maine and Canada. And what we're trying to do here is just make sure that Maine actually gets a fair deal. If you look at the amount of tariffs that have been applied, not just on Maine, but on a lot of our northern states that are doing cross-border trade with Canada, Canada and China have been the 2 worst countries when it comes to trade policy anywhere in the world. What a shame that is. China, you of course expect. They're our biggest economic competitor. I would expect that from China. I would not expect that from Canada. We have to remember, Canada is a state. Sorry, Freudian slip.
Okay, so that's the line from Vance, from Besant.
The United States and President Trump still want Canada to become a state. He did say that they're getting all the benefits of being a state without being one.
Okay, so all right, I've been really nice about certain questions. That's a stupid question from a reporter. I'm sorry. That's like, what, dude? Big boys and girls have really big questions. I have some questions, by the way, on trade and policy and what are we brokering behind closed doors and in public. I would love to know, like, what is the president seeking in some general terms? And like, what are you using some levers on the back end via the State Department as well as the Treasury Department? That's what I would want to know if I were the reporter asking this question. Not, does Trump still want Canada to be a state? Journalism degrees, I swear to God.
I think he would like Canada to come to the table and negotiate in good faith. They were offered quite a good deal last week. They chose to reject it. Unfortunately, Prime Minister Carney rose to power on an anti-American, anti-Trump platform. I believe he was more than 20 points behind, and he seems to have gone back to his old playbook. And I think one has to ask oneself, is he trying to benefit himself, the Liberal Party, or the Canadian people? Because they were offered a very good job.
Okay. So we'll bring you more updates, as we slide along that side of things. Now, there is a little bit more to talk about tonight. But before we send y'all over to a pretty good interview, because there's a huge amount of change happening in the Trump administration on the education side. Totally different. School choice looks so much different now than it did 10 years ago, and it's incredible to see. Also, over on the healthcare side, actually changing how Medicare and Medicaid address preventative care, so that we're not just putting people out to pasture for very severe diseases like kidney disease, for example. We have a former Texas representative here in just a bit talking about some major changes that the Trump administration is in the process of making, probably needs to go a little bit further on stopping some of those things. However, I do want to bring one quick update here. There has been one particular unknown projectile hitting the engine room of a tanker. Not sure which particular nation the tanker belongs to, but just off the coast of Oman, a particular oil tanker has been struck by an unknown projectile, causing damage to the engine room, disabling the vessel. We're not quite sure who it was that this ship belonged to, but like I've said before, given that it looks like it was near the little point of Oman in the Strait of Hormuz, there's a very, very good chance that one of the ways that the map changes through this entire conflict is that little part. I think I can actually show it to you on screen here. A little piece of the Strait of Oman, or excuse me, of the Gulf of Oman into the Strait of Hormuz. The little piece here that you can see owned by Oman, so you have the UAE down there in the bottom right-hand corner. Oman owns that little tip on the Strait of Hormuz. There's a very good chance that UAE, aka the United States, ends up walking away owning that, because the southern route's going to have to be maintained one way or another. So there are a couple of other bits and pieces that we will get into this week on some voter fraud and ID cases also up in Alaska. James O'Keefe is just doing all of the investigatory stuff there. A couple of other pieces on the DSA as well, but I didn't get a chance to on Friday. I'm going to take a chance right here and right now. By the way, if you like the show tonight, a like would help us tremendously. We'll throw a little like on there. It'd help us. Be pretty neat. Won't charge you nothing. In the meantime, I want to get into just a smidgen of mail time. Mail time. Mail time.
On the Tony Kinnett Cast.
All right. So, mail time, best way to get things up to us. In the description, there's a link to our Discord. And that way I can answer a couple of questions and have it on this nice little screen niftily and easily. So from Mitch Mess 500, a pretty decent question here. It says, why doesn't the U.S. government offer free tuition to American-born students to medical schools? If specializing in primary care medicine, I think that would help with the doctor shortage, I think. We've tried things like this before, and it doesn't. We tried it. There was an entire era of American kind of politics and the economy where we told every kid, oh, hey, just go and do this thing. There'll be all these jobs and it'll be amazing. And what it did was pushed a lot of people who are unqualified into various industries. So I'm all for certain regulations and taxes being cut from industries like the trade schools, for example. But just giving people free rides to things destroys innovation, destroys it. And also, given the way that a lot of our medical schools right now are operating, increasing just like, hey, you can be a doctor for free is how you're going to get a lot of really low quality doctors. So I don't think so. I don't think so at all. I think deregulating the industry is probably a really great start, like we do with eye care and with radiation and imaging, for example. All right, next great question for this evening. From Nutsmaster. Tony, hey, what's the deal with the president signing off some of his truths in tweets lately with praise be to Allah in the last few months? Maybe I just don't get the joke, but hearing a U.S. president praising a foreign god leaves a bad taste in my mouth. Okay, he is not praising a foreign god here. So I often will sign off tweets where I'm being very sarcastic with thoughts and prayers, because there are those who routinely mock that kind of on the left side of the aisle. So I'll put it this way. When Trump is like, Iran will be blown all the way back to the Stone Age, smacking rocks together, Iraqs together, if you will. And then he says, praise be to Allah. He's not saying, like, he's not getting down on the rug and going, Allah most beneficial and merciful. He's not doing that. That'd be mockery from the president. So there are a lot of people who are making a really big deal about that. That would be very dry, very, very dry humor on that one. And he's done that for a long time. So again, I'm more than happy to criticize him on certain things, but that's it's one of those slides here. From Holstein Heifer says, hey, Tony, when can we expect a final answer to your documentary on the data centers? We strongly support the idea. So for those who are just joining us, didn't see this Friday show, I don't blame you. There wasn't like a massive ton of news on Friday. I have floated that one of the only ways that this whole argument kerfluffle shenanigan on the AI data center thing, the only way that is going to finish, the only way that's going to be polished off, is for someone to do a kind of Discovery Channel how it's made. You remember how it's made? This week, waffle irons. And they like walk you through it, and like in the factory. You need like something like that mixed with like some Nick Shirley. So in order for us to do that, I need two things. Number one, I need a data center of somewhere out there to say, hey, Tony, yeah, sure, come on out. Let's do the thing. So I don't have that. I've asked. I haven't had any answers back yet. I need that. Number two, I need my bosses at the Daily Signal to approve the project, because documentaries cost money. Although I would definitely, float a lot of that money myself, because that's how much I believe this is important. So the answer is, I don't know. It may not happen at all. I want it to happen, but I'm not about to like bust in and like break down the door. I kind of am in the wrong culture for that. So next question here. Would they have to DNA test Ilhan Omar and her husband? I don't know the answer to that, but I think you're more likely to get Ilhan Omar on a case of financial fraud than you are to like tackle the immigration fraud thing. I think the financial fraud is probably going to be a lot better, where her husband was getting that, if she participated in it, who she knew on the campaign side of things regarding the Somali fraud and the feeding our children for future Somali wire fraud case. That's probably going to be more where you see a lot of the charges that stick. Don't get me wrong, I hear you. I'm picking up what you're putting down, but alas, that's one of those little pieces there. Oh, this is actually a pretty good question, even though it's kind of funny. From Scooter here, it says, which are we going to see first, the completion of the ballroom for the White House or an opinion by SCOTUS on it? With the rate that construction is completing, you're likely to see the ballroom about 80 to 90% finished before SCOTUS actually writes an opinion on it, in my opinion. That's just speculation there. We obviously try to be very honest with you guys when we're speculating. But that's my particular take. So, drink more water, your lips are super red. Yeah, probably. This is from my Cove Pure, that kind of a thing. Any other particular questions that are extra spicy this evening? Right before we finish. Tony, why do we need data centers today? That's a very, very good question. And the answer that I'm going to give you is there's a lot of different stuff in the modern tech world that requires space and processing power. And before things get really smaller in tech, usually they're very big. Now, notice I'm not saying whether or not we need lots of data centers for very different kinds of things. A data center is not just a magical, mythical place. This is why I think that being very honest about what a data center is and does is important. It could be for any different kinds of industries. There's all different, I mean, again, just like a restaurant can be a million different kinds of cuisine and flavor and service and type and often, all this different stuff. That's how data centers are as well. And I don't think that answering it just kind of in one block is probably the best answer here. I'm currently doing the deep dive on this, though, documentary or no. How many jobs are actually created or how many aren't? That's something that we're looking into on this side. But why do we need them? Because that's where the economy is expanding. That's true. I mean, it's going to expand somewhere. And we are in a tech race with China. We are. So they are necessary in some way. The question becomes when and where and how. And the why really depends on the industry, if that makes any sense. I think that's probably... does every deportation require a court to say deport? That's from Grace M. No. The actual constitutional understanding is that if an illegal immigrant is here and they committed a crime of some sort, they don't necessarily need an order of removal. But if a lawyer gets to them and then they try claiming asylum here, then things get sticky. That's why the definition of asylum matters. No, there is no federal super duper statute that says that you have all of these super amazing Miranda rights for that kind of a thing. That's not the case. Not at all. So, well, that side of things here. Yeah. Are data centers noisy? Depends on the data center. Again, we'll have to kind of dive into this kind of a thing. It's why I think that it's so important to actually do that kind of a study. If they get Ilhan Omar on, well, okay, last two questions here I think are how does it feel to be non-socialist JD Vance? I think some of the claims about Vance being socialist are like really, really, really overblown. I think he is a hardcore populist. But that's another take for another time. I'll give you my take on that when we actually get to primary season in the next election. I think a lot of people are diving way too far into it right now because there's not a lot of news some days, and it's very easy to like do deep dives for clicks. From Steve says, hey, if the GOP maintains control after midterms, do you think the Trump administration will shift major policy initiatives? In some ways, yes. In some ways, no. So on foreign policy, do I think they'll shift after the midterms? Oh, yeah. I do think so. Do I know what those areas are? Maybe. We'll have to see if we win the midterms first. By the way, I do think that it's far more likely that right now, today, August the 24th, Monday, it's more likely the U.S. controls the House and the Senate. Probably more likely they control the House instead of the Senate. Now, before you call me retarded, my argument for that is simply that the redistricting in the South matters a lot. The last question is on Ilhan Omar's financial fraud. Can't you just keep going backwards on various fraud? Yes, you can, but it depends on how the federal court would prosecute that kind of stuff. Take off your glasses for the drinking game. There you go. All right. We'll kick you guys over to this excellent interview on the Tony Kinnett Cast channel. It's good stuff. It's the Tony Kinnett Cast here on the Daily Signal, nationally syndicated, first on 93 WIBC. Take care.
Every state is home to significant historic sites that tell the American story, but not every site is telling that story honestly and fairly. That's why the Heritage Foundation created the Heritage Guide to Historic Sites. This interactive guide equips American citizens with the tools they need to enjoy the sites that depict some of the greatest moments in our nation's history, analyzing them for historical accuracy, and provides resources for families or educators planning a visit. From Mount Vernon to Independence Hall to Gettysburg and more, Americans deserve transparency, and sites that steward our history faithfully deserve our gratitude. The Heritage Guide to Historic Sites invites every American to rediscover the places and stories that define our nation, whether it's across the country or in your backyard. Visit historicsites.heritage.org to start your adventure today.